Somehow Penn State football is able to do it again, where they find the diamonds in the rough before everybody else, other schools, the recruiting sites that just aren't paying enough attention to these prospects.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily Penn State Nittany Lions podcast. I'm your host, Zach Seyko, and we are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks so much for making us your first listen and watch every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. You got to download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. That's promo code Locked On. And we welcome him back from the Locked On Podcast Network, the recruiting expert here, and that is Brian Smith. And since this is a recruiting episode, today's episode is also brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. LinkedIn helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. Terms and conditions apply. You can keep up with Brian on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can also follow his show, Locked On Seminoles, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're not already, become an everydayer. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast as well for the latest conversations around your favorite Penn State sports teams. Brian, Penn State recruiting isn't exactly turning the corner here, but in terms of who they already have committed and the targets that they are still trying to get to commit, just saw an increase in the rankings. And this is something that we've discussed a lot on the show before, Brian, is how Penn State always seems to find the diamonds, yes, diamonds with an S, in the rough. They always get in at the ground level and ride the elevator to the top when it comes to these prospects. And, I mean, just to name a few, Alex Tatch, somebody who still isn't ranked by ESPN, somebody who's ranked lowly on other sites, is now almost a top 50 player, according to On3. Let's take Matt Zollers, for example. Matt Zollers, and we were talking about, well, if SEC schools really want him to commit, that means he's the real deal. Well, he just went from a four-star quarterback consensus, everybody respects his ability, to now the number 3 quarterback in the class of 2025, still uncommitted, but a top 5 quarterback in the nation and a top 25 player overall. And Penn State has been recruiting Zollers from early on, Tatch early on, and that's just to name the couple of them right there. There are others that we're going to discuss, but your impressions of how Penn State is just able to do this time in and time again, beat the recruiting rankings to the punch.
That's relationships, advanced scouting, and getting kids on campus. Once you see if you can kind of match up with a kid and their personality, when you get them on the campus, that's when you can seal the deal. But it's the advanced scouting that starts it. Recruiting starts in 7th, 8th grade. They get an idea. There are a lot of different companies you can get information from. And, of course, you still talk to high school coaches and do your own evaluations. The biggest key at the end, though, is still those relationships, man. They do a great job. It's one of the best staffs in the country. And it starts with Coach Franklin. And it goes on down all the way through the training staff. Everybody is a part of it, because when you come on campus, you don't just get impressed by the coaches. It's the academic staff, it's the training staff, recruiting staff. Everybody's involved. I haven't heard anybody that I've spoken to in the last few years say that Penn State didn't do a good job on like an unofficial or setting up the trips before they ever get there. They're organized, and that's how you win in recruiting right there.
Well, when you bring up that point, I think of Jamonte Waller, for example, somebody who never ultimately committed to Penn State, but just from what I was hearing from insiders that are involved in recruiting like yourself, more localized to the region, to the Northeast region. But Waller, who was from the state of Mississippi originally, a player like him should have never visited Penn State or had any interest in them to begin with. And James Franklin and company seem to get the attention of those kinds of prospects.
That's the personality part. I live in Alabama now, and I can tell you, I know Jamonte. That is not a kid based on where he's from that should ever have any interest outside of the South. Like, he's from 30 minutes or so from Louisiana, down in the southwest corner of Mississippi, from a really good program. But, like, that's just culturally the polar opposite of what Pennsylvania is like. So I think it's interesting that, number one, they went after him because they put the trust in themselves. They got a lot of confidence. But number two, there for a while, they might have been the most likely destination for him. So things, recruiting changes and everything happens for a reason. But I think it's cool that Penn State doesn't care. Like, they got a running back committed right now from Texas. They're after Taz Williams and all these other different kids, random states, Texas, Florida, whatever it is.
Yep.
If they think they found a fit, they don't care where the kid's from. It's totally different than what I grew up with, because Paterno recruited from about 5 states, maybe 6, and that was it. But at the same time, you know what? If it works for this staff, that's all that matters.
And for Penn State still, the complaint is, and this goes specifically to someone like Ethan Grunkmeyer and to anybody else. I mean, Tatch wasn't ranked that highly up until a few days ago, if that, right? In the last 24, 48 hours here, because these rankings are newly released and they'll be continually updated. So I imagine players will get those rankings boosts over the course, because this isn't finished. We're still in the early stages of the classes 2025. But the complaint is Penn State settles. They're chasing after 3 stars because they can't get anybody else. But Penn State is very good at, like you said, building those relationships, beating the recruiting rankings, because that's their job. It's different when you're somebody who, works in recruiting specifically, and you miss on a player or don't necessarily scout them correctly. There really isn't, I guess, a consequence to your job, if you will, Brian. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the work that you do. I think you do incredible work and across the board, whether that's on 3, Rivals, 24/7, ESPN, etc. But when it comes to the coaching staff, if they miss on players, like that's an attack on their job, because that's their job to recruit, to evaluate, because that translates to wins and losses, butts and seats, success on the football field, right? If a scout that works for a recruiting service doesn't exactly have the right read on a player or two, it's okay, because it doesn't necessarily threaten results at the end of the day for your institution, if you will. Am I making any sense there?
No, it does. I mean, there are certain guys in my industry that I think are terrible at it, and there are certain ones that I'll ask their opinion. The ones I don't ask, there's a reason. So at the end of the day, yeah, this is a very difficult and risky business, because we're talking about projecting teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what it is you're doing. They generally suck at knowing what they're going to do in 10 minutes, what in 3 years. So it's hard. But we put a lot of time and effort into it. I mean, I'm going to not 1, but 2 Under Armour events this week alone. You got to spend the time on the road and go see the kids and interview them and, measurables and all that stuff. And it's still hard, man. I get all the access that I could possibly want going to all these camps and combines. It's still not easy. So, yeah, I get it. And there's some guys that probably make Penn State fans mad if they drop a kid on Penn State's side, whatever. But every fan base hates all the recruiting rankings, not just Penn State fans.
So trust in the coaches. And this, the everydayers remember this, but if you're new to the show, if you're new to these conversations with myself and Brian, you understand that if Penn State takes a commitment, throw the recruiting rankings out the window. It doesn't matter if somebody doesn't have them ranked. It doesn't matter if somebody has them ranked properly. And 9 times out of 10, what we're seeing is that these players take an astronomical jump through the rankings across the board. It's not like one rankings has them differently. Yes, that's the case at the moment. But when the class of 2025 is finished, everybody will settle and have Matt Zollers as a top 10 at a very minimum, top 5 quarterback when all's said and done. One recruiting site might have that a little different. But if Penn State is targeting them, if Penn State takes a commitment from them, Xavier Thomas, for example, is a 3-star and isn't ranked just about by anybody, right? People had to make recruiting profiles specifically for this player because he was flying that much under the radar. But Penn State took a commitment from him. So trust the coaches whose jobs are on the line to make these good decisions with that when they take a commitment. The final idea here before we talk about Marques Hagans and the wide receivers, because there might be a hot streak when it comes to the wide receiver spot and recruiting, Brian. But yeah, Penn State, are they in a sense, I don't want to say settling, but almost doing a lot of extra work, time, diligence to find those players that are being missed by other schools, competition, the recruiting sites, the recruiting services, when they can go after the Bryce Underwoods of the world, the top prospects. Sure, they'll get a Nicholas Singleton and a Denai Dennis Sutton, a 5-star Micah Parsons, who are in state, in the region, but you never see Penn State, at least in the conversation, for that truly difference-making player that's recruited across the nation number one player on the board. Well, people might say, well, what about Drew Aller? Well, Drew Aller, again, was that case of he was a 3-star. Nobody was really talking to him. Penn State built that relationship with him early in the recruiting process, and then he became what he became. But my point is, I'm talking about the players that are at the top of their game right now, at the top of the recruiting services, everybody wants them. And yet 9 times out of 10, in this case, Brian, Penn State's really on the outside looking in every single time.
A lot of that's just NIL. Penn State doesn't pay up front. It is
simple,
what it is.
Pretty simple.
No, I mean, there's no way around it. I mean, I talked to a lot of people and the parents, and I mean, a big thing now is some kids are getting a lot of money just to visit schools. I don't think Penn State does that necessarily, but
they do not.
If, even if some booster was helping on the side, they're not going to do it for everybody. And it's, it's a long way to Penn State for a lot of the kids, like where I live down in the deep South. Yeah. It's just different. And recruiting is not heading in a quote unquote good direction, in my opinion, overall, because NCAA is just all but toothless. But at the same time, I've really kind of found a niche. They take kids that want to be committed there, and they're going to redshirt a few more kids, whatever. But they're only a few players away from like being a top 5 team. It's really ironic because they stunk in some big games, but it's just scoring. Like defensively, I mean, you can't say a word if you're a Penn State fan, especially since they're always on the field. They're close. Now, if they could get one more kid that's an elite player, whether defense or offense, I get it. That helps. But at the same time, I mean, if you're not going to go out and do that with NIL, it's kind of hard. So I don't blame Franklin for those kinds of things.
Penn State moves up. If you're looking at On3's recruiting site, they move up from 16th to 11th overall. So they're just outside of the top 10 in terms of class of 2025 team rankings, and then move from 4th to 3rd in the Big Ten. When we come back here on Locked On Nittany Lions, wide receiver. Well, they got Lyric Samuel, and Lyric Samuel was one of those players that saw a rise in the recruiting rankings and becomes the number 1 prospect in the state of New York. Marques Hagans, is he on a little bit of a hot streak here as Penn State has a crystal ball forecast for not one, but multiple wide receiver targets? We're going to discuss that next here on the show. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. You got to download the Gametime app because buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets to everything sports, music, comedy, theater near you. Some of the things that I like about the Gametime app experience, because I've used Gametime myself, are the last minute tickets, but you get flash deals, discounts on those last minute tickets. It's easy to buy and find tickets for every kind of event in your area. Gametime does a really good job of sorting everything so you're not going to looking and wondering what's going on around you. And then probably the best feature, image views of the seats. You're not wondering, you're not second guessing what it's going to be like at the venue. You know exactly what your point of view is going to be before you get to the event, before you get to the venue. Lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection are included as well. So snag the tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app today, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account. Redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And the Locked On Podcast Network is making history. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus the national shows covering each and every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on YouTube and the free Fire TV channels app. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. If you're not already, you can keep up with Brian on X, formerly known as Twitter, and also follow his show, Locked On Seminoles, for your Florida State fix, but also your national recruiting takes as well when it comes to football. And Brian, back to the wide receivers specifically, and we focused on them when they did get Lyric Samuel. And Lyric Samuel's 6'4", a little bit undersized in terms of his weight, but who's to say he can't build that? We've seen Penn State prospects who finally get on campus add 30 pounds in one winter workout cycle. So don't think that because Lyric Samuel's a little undersized now that he can't put on the weight. But going along with this, Lyric Samuel is a good start because he's going to be, at the end of the day, a consensus 4-star, a highly touted wide receiver in this class of 2025. And Penn State is getting the attention of other serious contenders. We mentioned a name Lex Cyrus. Cyrus in the state of Pennsylvania is, depending on where you look, a 3-star, but to describe him, a shifty slot wide receiver. That's somebody that is going to emulate more. I'm not saying a direct player comparison to KJ Hamler, but he's closer to KJ Hamler than he is, right, or Parker Washington than the likes of Justin Shorter and some other taller wide receiver like a Jawan Johnson, to name the few. But that's not the only one. Jeff Exner. Jeff Exner is a wide receiver in the Maryland, D.C. area, and Exner, who is a 4-star wide receiver as well in his own right, is now forecasted, crystal ball projection, whatever you want to call it, to Penn State. So Marques Hagans is slowly building out this wide receiver class, or I should say quickly. It was slow. It was a slow process, but now it's really sped up here in just a matter of weeks. And Penn State is going to get, I would say, at least 3 wide receivers with the possibility of 4 or even 5 in the class of 2025.
This is a really unique situation because I thought that they would struggle. And I'm guessing that you did too after last year in the big games. But this is further proof that if you put in the time, relationships, these receivers tend to be pretty confident anyway. But hey, why should I go there? They haven't done anything. The other side of that is they can sell. You can be the guy that turns this around. That's the pitch to teams that struggle at any position. It doesn't have to be receiver. And they do have some young arms in that room that are pretty impressive. So hopefully for Penn State fans, they get to see some of these guys play and be successful soon. But recruiting is on the rise at the wide receiver position. Now I still need to see them get that really elite guy to feel on board. It doesn't have to be Jeremiah Smith, but it still needs to be another guy to add in. They need an impact guy, a deep threat, et cetera, to kind of go with some of these others. But I like where they're at. Maybe they end up with 4 or 5. It's not out of the question.
Well, and that's the idea too. I think it took some adjustment period from Haggins himself. Spent a long time at Virginia, right? That's I don't want to say that's all he knows, but grew up in the state of Virginia, played at UVA, then went to the NFL shortly, and then came back and became a coach at UVA, his alma mater. So there's a little bit, there's a difference in style as far as how they want to recruit, what resources he has available to it, and then the coaching part of it himself. So everything that he's learned at UVA, I don't want to say necessarily has to be unlearned at Penn State, but you're going to have to do a little bit of things differently to keep up with the speed of the game now, because UVA and Penn State are on completely different levels when it comes to this stuff here. And I think that Haggins is finally settling in. It's also environment too. You have to you have to change your pitch. You have to change your approach to convincing someone to go to UVA in the state of Virginia versus somebody who comes to central Pennsylvania and Happy Valley.
Yeah, if he's struggling at all, I don't see it anymore. They're getting kids that other schools that, they compete against consistently want. And I also think they're getting some kids that some people probably have underrated, like we started the show with. Penn State does its due diligence with the rankings in their own room. They don't care what rivals or anybody else says. I know a lot of these guys are my friends. They don't, and they shouldn't. I know recruiting analysts like myself, we all talk to college coaches, but everybody has to have their own ranking. I stand around and talk to different guys, whether it's Wiltfong, whether it's Ivins, whether it's Garcia, et cetera, at all these events, and we have our opinions. But we know that college coaches look at it differently because each system, the smallest thing is different. So I think Penn State is doing a really good job to fit them. And here's the other thing. When I do some of these boards and look at positions nationally, the new category I have is the touchiest one. It involves the portal. Which of these kids that I know is the least likely to be a flight risk? I think Penn State is taking fewer flight risks as a rule than, say, a school like Colorado, being very conservative. That's about as far apart in a program as those two could be. Or some of the other schools that are trying to come up. Like UCF takes about 15 transfers, about 15 recruits a year. That's pretty high risk.
It also has to do with the fact that I like to use my dartboard analogy for a lot of different things. The more darts you have to throw, the more opportunities you have to hit a bullseye. Even if you're awful at darts, you're more likely to have, with ample opportunity, to land a few really good prospects at any position. And in this case, Brian, we kind of laughed about it a little bit, but this is the position that Penn State is in. They need wide receivers. So what do? they go out and offer 80 plus scholarships at this point in time. And who knows if that number is going to increase, but 80 plus wide receivers for the class of 2025 have been offered by Penn State alone. You're bound to get 3, 4, 5 kids to commit from that group.
I'm trying to think of a year that a program, a receiver, that a major program like the Nittany Lions offered that many at that spot. And I'm just going to throw this to you. How many of those would, before they had a commitment, do you think were committable on the spot? Because like that's insane. So that's like the number of kids that Clemson will offer for their whole class, if more than. So it's just bizarre to me. But you know what? If it got you in the door with some kids, and now, I mean, they're obviously rolling with wide receiver recruiting and kind of getting to that point where they can be picky.
Yep.
It worked for them. So I don't know, man. Everybody finds their own niche. I talk about it all the time. Maybe Penn State has found theirs.
I want to bring up a couple of other names that have visits scheduled. Penn State, and I mentioned the kids who are projected to Penn State to ultimately commit. Lex Cyrus, I would say, is the most serious contender, and Jeff Exeter isn't too far off. Both of them will commit in due time, from what from the local insiders do truly believe. There's another one from the state of New Jersey, Desi Jones, and I think this just goes back to comfortability. Again, Haggins was very comfortable in his home area of Virginia and knew how to recruit primarily D.C., Maryland, Virginia. But then, I'm not saying that Virginia never recruited kids from the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, but like you said, going back to relationships, Haggins had to do that. He had to build relationships with New Jersey. New Jersey kids are different from Virginia kids, who are different from Alabama, Mississippi kids that we talked about, right? With the example of Jamonte Waller. And so you're seeing now a Lyric Samuel, for example, a Desi Jones from the state of New Jersey. There's one other player that is pretty interesting as far as Penn State wide receiver recruits go, because he also saw a boost in his rankings, and that's Romero Eisen. So when you're thinking of wide receivers, is there anybody else? Do you want to stick with this? Because you can't limit yourself, Brian. You can't limit yourself and say, because like you said, 80 offers. Can all those players, are they committable types of players? What happens if you sell yourself too short almost? You know, you have all these flyers out there for wide receivers, but then you end up taking commitments from players that don't exactly meet that bar of top tier skill level.
That's what I meant earlier. It's like, how many of these are committable? Plus, you got to worry about skill set. There's a boundary spot. There's a slot. There are guys that can play multiple. The truly elite guys can come in and do it. You got to make sure whoever your number one or number two is, that you have a realistic chance to sign. You need to know that young man's timeline to a T. And I know they got to be careful about it, but every coach wants him to decide earlier than later, because if you wait towards the end and you don't get him, you also lose all the other kids. It's part of the time coaches aren't in control, and there's certain kids you just got to wait it out. And it's a crapshoot on signing day, and that's why coaches don't have a lot of hair like me, or they're just always in the psychiatry room. But recruits are going to do what they're going to do. This is the one time they get to kind of roll the dice and do it their way. So part of this recruiting deal, understanding timelines and then finding the right fits, because you got to make some really hard choices, because you never know when a kid's going to call you and say, I want to commit. Sometimes you got to turn it down. Those are awkward conversations.
Exactly. And why we talk about the value of Penn State actually taking a verbal commitment, and why that is so important. So an excellent point that, yes, Penn State does in fact turn down commits from other players that they have offered or that they're just talking to in the recruiting cycle. Somebody who is committed, class of 2025 quarterback, and Penn State's trying to take two, but Bekkem Kritza is returning to an area, Brian, that you're familiar with, that he's familiar with, as he's kind of flip-flopping decisions of where he wants to play football, but he's made a decision of what he's going to do next season for his senior year. We're going to discuss that decision and if it makes sense for him on Locked On Nittany Lions. Since this is a recruiting episode, let's talk about the best in recruiting, LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing a lot of hats, so many hats, and might not have the time and resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even quicker. 2.5 million, that's right, million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Get buckets with your first bet right now on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more is a winner. That's $150 in bonus bets, simply if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players, all your favorite NBA teams with things like quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. If you like a group of bets, you can combine all of them together into that parlay for boosted odds and boosted winnings. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/locked on and shoot your shot. That's FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. And remember, if you're not already, become an everydayer. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast for the latest conversations around your favorite Penn State sports teams, including recruiting. And if you want to keep up with Brian, follow him on X, formerly known as Twitter, and on the Locked On Seminoles podcast, can be found on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, of course. In this final segment, Bekkem Kritza, the only quarterback commit at the moment. Penn State targeting Matt Zollers, Malik Washington, hopefully one of the two will commit to the class of 2025 ultimately for the Nittany Lions. But Kritza, who's from Colorado, goes to Miami Central, is a backup quarterback there, then transfers back and plays at Colorado, and then there's the transfer rules. It's different state by state when it comes to high school, but was held off of the football field for a little bit and then was able to play. And now going back to Miami Central once again to finish off his football season. We've seen this before. T.A. Cunningham, who is currently an early enrollee, did this. Now, not in regards to Penn State, but did this with his high school career. Was at Georgia and then went to a Florida school and then went to California, right? He was all over the place and then it actually hurt him in the long run for his recruiting, but Penn State still saw something in him that they believe that he can be an impact player. Kritza, I don't necessarily know that this decision emulates the exact same thing, but it's this back and forth. And now he goes back to Miami Central where he wasn't actively playing. Brian, does this decision make sense? Because Central, we know, is one of the best high school football programs in not only Florida, but all of the country. Is Kritza, is he trying to challenge himself to push himself there? Do you see a path for him onto the football field as a starting quarterback? When you saw this decision actually finalized here, what were your thoughts?
I'd heard about it right around the time that it was Battle Miami in South Florida. He was down with one of the 7-on-7 teams, and he looked pretty good, to be honest with you. I heard about it. I didn't say anything to him, but at the same time, you know what? I kind of appreciate guys that go and get challenged, because you're going to get challenged at Central in a million ways. Culturally, talk about the head coach there, Jude Joseph. He's a legend. That neighborhood, that community rallies around the Rockets. They've won like 9 or 10 state titles, something ridiculous like that in the last 15 years. I forget what it is. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Do you want to be a part of that? You need to know for sure, because it'll kick you in the teeth if you're not ready. So he's going back there to find out. So I'm sure I'll see him live this next year. That's a lock, and I'll let you know more. But I think it's pretty intriguing because they got skill guys for days. If they can just get them the ball, the rest take care of itself. I assure you, they got players. So he's going to learn, and he's going to go in top competition. They do not schedule lightly.
Do you know what the quarterback situation is at this given time? Because Miami Central, obvious, kind of like college football teams, don't necessarily take a quarterback if they don't need one. So is it a matter of building depth? Is it because they see him as a senior leader? There's former familiarity with him being on the team once upon a time. Why do they take Kritza back in this case?
Talent. I mean, even if they had somebody, they would take him. I haven't checked in there yet, and until we get to May, I don't even pay attention in South Florida. They transfer like I get a cup of water down there. So, I don't pay much attention. When I see Jube Joseph or if I see Larry Bluestein or somebody else on the recruiting trail, I'll find out that way. But there's a long way to go to May. It doesn't sound like it's very long, but in Florida, 3 days is 6 years. So it's just the way it is. Different culture, man. He'll be competing with somebody, though. I guarantee it.
What is it about Kritza's game? Because when I watch the film, when I watch the highlights, what stands out to me is the athleticism. He's a multi-sport athlete, right? Very talented just overall. But the arm strength. He can just naturally fling a football, and that thing sails down the field. Is there anything else that you say, this is what Penn State fans need to look forward to when Kritza's ultimately on campus, regardless of who that other quarterback prospect is? And maybe at the end of the day, if Penn State, I don't want to speak this into existence, right? But would Penn State be okay if he's the only quarterback in the class of 2025?
He's got a high ceiling. I don't know if he's going to be that guy or not. He could be a boomer bust like 98% of quarterbacks are. There's only so many guys like Julian Lewis where it's kind of obvious. Yeah. But at the same time, he needs to eat and he needs to get stronger. He's definitely gotten more accurate over the last year. I can tell you that. Now it's just all the little material things that go in with being a quarterback. But, yeah, I don't think they should just take one if you can get two, especially since Zolar's in the backyard. But if he ended up being your only guy, you wouldn't be in a bad spot either. Again, he's got an arm. He's a natural athlete. He's kind of a slinky. He's just a long and lanky kid. So a lot of guys were like that coming out of high school, ended up playing in the NFL. And I have complete faith in their strength and conditioning program in Happy Valley.
And he was originally recruited by Mike Yurcich, and ultimately when he kind of found out about everything and said that he more or less knew what the situation was of Yurcich not being there next season, still felt confident enough to commit to Penn State football, even though there was uncertainty at that offensive coordinator spot. He's Brian Smith, the recruiting expert for the Locked On Podcast Network. If you want more national football recruiting takes, keep up with him on X, formerly known as Twitter. Check out his show, Locked On Seminoles, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're not already becoming an everydayer for this show, subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Let us know in the comments what you think about this class of 2025, how Penn State is doing. Like this episode, share it with friends and family. Brian, thanks so much for the time, and looking forward to our next conversation about Penn State recruiting.
Thank you, sir. I look forward to it as well.